The world is full of fraudsters and scam artists. And most of them are very sophisticated, stealing millions of pounds from unsuspecting victims every year. From pension and investment scams to callers pretending to be from your bank, there are no end of con tricks designed to relieve you of your hard-earned cash. But the biggest scam the world has ever seen is literally hiding in plain sight. It's called the United Kingdom. This may come as a shock to many, but the United Kingdom is really not what it claims to be: a united kingdom. Although recognised by the international community as a sovereign state, that recognition came about as a result of a lie, a confidence trick so huge that it has largely gone undetected for more than 300 years. To understand this, it's essential to go right back to when the United Kingdom was allegedly founded, 1707. The UK was meant to be the creation of an entirely new state as a result of the effective abolition of the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of Scotland. But that never happened. That's because the kingdoms of England and Scotland are so entirely different that it was not possible to legally merge them into one country. The reason for this is that the Crown of Scotland represents the community of the realm, the people, who in Scotland are sovereign over the king and their government, whereas in England, absolute power rests with the person wearing the crown, which is why, under English law, no king or queen of England can ever be prosecuted for any crimes they commit, no matter how hideous they may be. In terms of population, England is by far and away the larger of the two countries, and back in the 18th century it was certainly the more powerful of the two kingdoms. The foundations of the British Empire were laid when England and Scotland were still recognised as separate kingdoms, when England established a series of overseas possessions and trading posts in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Scotland's relationship with its southern neighbour prior to that had always been turbulent, with England making several attempts to invade, occupy and annex Scotland into England, as it had done with Wales. The major conflicts between the two countries include the Wars of Independence 1296 to 1357 and the Rough Wooing of 1544 to 1551, also known as the 8 Years' War. At that time, England attacked Scotland in order to break the old alliance between Scotland and France. England feared Scotland might be used as a springboard for future invasion by France. In addition, Henry VIII also declared war on Scotland in a failed attempt to force the Scottish Parliament to agree to a marriage between his son Edward and heir, who was just 6 years old at the time, and Mary, Queen of Scots, who was an infant. So, when Queen Elizabeth I died with no heirs, James VI of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and great-great-grandson of Henry VII of England, also became King of England. But both England and Scotland remained independent sovereign countries with their own parliaments, judiciaries and laws. There are other precedents for this, where a king of one country is also the king of another independent country, such as happened in Norway, Denmark and Sweden, for example, in the 15th and even 19th century. However, unlike these Scandinavian countries, which all remained independent, Scotland was eventually railroaded into a union with England, largely as a result of England's Navigation Acts of 1651 and 1660, which effectively blockaded Scotland, preventing it from being able to trade with European countries such as France and the Netherlands, with whom England was largely hostile. England also prevented Scotland trading with English colonies overseas. Prior to James VI of Scotland also becoming King of England in 1603, often incorrectly referred to as the Union of the Crowns, the Scottish economy had been flourishing completely independently of the English one, and developing a closer economic partnership with England at the time was unthinkable given Scotland's main trading partners were in continental Europe. However, King James's accession to the English throne served only the political and dynastic ambitions of James and was completely detrimental to Scotland. The exports which Scotland offered were largely irrelevant to the English economy, and whilst the Privy Council of Scotland did maintain some control over Scotland's economic policy, the foreign policy of Scotland was now very much in English hands, which limited Scotland's hitherto expansive trade with continental Europe, and worse still, forced Scotland into English wars, often with former allies. As a result, Scotland suffered economically. The lack of manpower caused by fighting England's wars severely impacted on Scotland's agricultural industry, which led to food shortages and even famines, and the over-reliance of Scottish landowners on imported goods led to a deficit of financial capital as gold and silver were exported overseas. Scotland was increasingly forced to seek trading alternatives, and as colonial expansion by European countries grew, Scotland attempted to establish a Scottish colony with whom it could trade in the Gulf of Darien. However, the scheme was sabotaged by England, a major power at the time, mostly by putting pressure on European powers against investing in the new Scottish colony. Despite these hardships caused by England's undermining of Scotland, most ordinary people in Scotland, and indeed many in the Scottish Parliament, remained firmly against the notion of union with England, which had been fostered by King James and his successors in England, including Queen Anne. Indeed, many notable figures involved in the Scottish Enlightenment, including merchant, author, artist and landowner, John Clarke of Eldon, declared that Scots had become England's slaves since they were denied not only their rights as fellow Britons, but their rights under the law of nations. In 1703, the Scottish Parliament adopted legislation to counter English aggression and attempted to ensure that Scottish foreign policy would be independent of England. This, together with attempts to seek further autonomy from England, led England to retaliate. Scottish ministers were bribed, and England passed the Alien Act in 1705. That act would not only make every Scot in England an alien, leading to the confiscation of their English estates, but Scottish wares would also be banned in England unless Scotland appointed commissioners to negotiate for union by Christmas that year. It was a plain attempt to annex Scotland, and it worked because, in 1706, under this immense pressure, provocation and bribery, Scottish ministers, very much against the will of the people who had no say, voted for union with England. Scotland was now effectively an annexed state. Despite riots throughout Scotland and the Jacobite Rising just 38 years later in 1745, which was far more than simply an attempt to overthrow the monarchy, it was also about restoring Scotland's independence as a nation-state. But Scotland now remained firmly in England's grip, so much so that following the Jacobite Rising, England had no fewer than 600 military garrisons across Scotland, and the military's crackdown was brutal. It was, say some historians, ethnic cleansing, and involved the torture and murder of dissenters at the hands of British troops. But the narrative by England ever since has been that the United Kingdom was established after Scotland, and England willingly joined in an equal partnership for the benefit of both countries. The reality, however, from a historic viewpoint, is very different and still negatively impacts on Scotland today. And this official narrative is repeated over and over again by the English-controlled mainstream media in Scotland. But what is less known is that the United Kingdom was never and could never be united and therefore created. The UK is a fraud state consisting of just England and its annexed colonies. England, in law, has absolutely no territorial or legal rights in Scotland whatsoever. Sure, the then Scottish Parliament signed the Treaty of Union in 1707, many Scottish ministers having been bribed by England to do so. But the crowns of England and Scotland could never be merged because they were, and still are, entirely different systems. Because under Scots law, which is still, even under the terms of the Treaty of Union, the only law which applies in Scotland, a monarch has to take the Scottish accession oath in its entirety to be lawfully King or Queen of Scots, and no English king or queen has ever done this. Why? Because the Scottish Crown represents the community of the realm, where the people themselves are sovereign, not the monarch, and no English monarch has ever been prepared to cede any sovereignty over to the people by acknowledging that the people of Scotland are sovereign in law. So England simply rebranded itself as the United Kingdom, thus ensuring the success of the biggest fraud ever to be perpetrated in history, a fraud which continues right up until the present day. So why does this matter? Because under this illusion, England illegally takes all of Scotland's massive natural resources worth many trillions of pounds out of the country with little or no benefit to Scotland itself. Since 1989 to 2023, the value of Scottish oil and gas alone to the English-UK exchequer has been worth just shy of £15 trillion, according to Westminster's own figures. There can be absolutely no doubt that had Scotland been independent when the black gold first started pouring ashore in the early 1970s, Scotland would have been one of the wealthiest countries in the world today. How do we know this? Because a report commissioned by the Wilson government in 1974 said so. Professor Gavin McCrone's report was swiftly classified as top secret and buried for 30 years to prevent Scotland choosing to go its own way, whilst at the same time shutting down Scotland's stock exchange to ensure Scotland gained minimum benefit from its own resources. So whilst Norway, a country with a similar sized population to Scotland, has gone on to become the fourth richest country in the world with a sovereign wealth fund worth $1.7 trillion and large public ownership of its resources, Scotland has no sovereign wealth fund and has seen very little, if any, benefit from 5 decades of oil and gas which have been sold off to foreign companies by England. Hiding this information and distorting the narrative has been the approach adopted by the government in England ever since. But in reality, that government of another country has effectively stolen these resources by simply masquerading as the United Kingdom. The UK, or in reality the English state, has no lawful territorial right over Scotland or its resources. After all, if someone stole your car and sold it on, the new owner would have it confiscated even if they had bought it in good faith, and the car would be returned to its original owner. Now, those who argue in favour of the continuation of the Union argue that the oil has run out and Scotland has missed the boat, so what's the point in Scotland becoming independent now? After all, England would never be able to make full reparations for what it has stolen from Scotland. It has squandered Scotland's wealth largely on tax breaks for the wealthiest, and has, in the process, run up a debt of £2.6 trillion, which is around 98% of the UK's GDP. However, the claim that oil has run out is completely untrue, and besides, Scotland is entering into a renewable energy boom potentially worth as much, if not more, than its oil reserves were. In 2013, a year before the Scottish independence referendum, UK Oil and Gas published a report revealing that there was at least £1.7 trillion worth of oil still left in Scottish waters, and in 2023, the then UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak announced the granting of hundreds of new oil and gas licences in Scottish waters. So, claims in 2014 that oil had all but run out were obviously untrue, like so many other claims made by unionists led by the government in London. And Scotland's renewable energy, like oil and gas, is being sold off by England to foreign companies, and the so-called UK government is extracting the renewable energy out of Scotland with little or no benefit to Scotland or its people, while Scots pay among the highest energy prices in Europe. Compare Scotland to Norway, where between 80 to 90% of its renewable electricity capacity is publicly owned. Scots, despite owning these resources under the Crown of Scotland, which lies dormant but is still there representing the Kingdom of Scotland and therefore the people, pay massively inflated prices to foreign firms for energy that belongs to them, thanks to the energy privatisation policies of another country. Of course, unionists argue that Scots voted to remain in the United Kingdom in 2014 as a sign of the UK's legitimacy. The reality, however, is that the truth about Scotland's actual constitutional position has been hidden from Scots for over 300 years, and the narrative and even law-breaking by the so-called UK government during the referendum purdah period, when it offered more empty promises through its compliant media to persuade Scots to say no to leaving the Union, prevailed. The fact is, the UK is just England and its annexed territories. A handful of Scottish MPs can never overturn decisions made in what even former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson described as the English Parliament at Westminster because they are massively outnumbered by English MPs. Thanks to a distorted and flawed UK electoral system, for 51 out of the past 70 years, Scots have been governed by Conservative governments elected by English voters which have not won a general election in Scotland since 1954, hardly the sign of a healthy democracy. And for the remaining 19 years, when Labour were in power as they are again since 2024, Scotland just happened to vote the same way as English voters, but still did not determine the outcome. As the 2016 Brexit vote in which England dragged Scotland out of the EU against its will demonstrated, Scotland as part of the UK not only has no control over its resources and key economic decisions, it also has no say over its place in the world, unlike far smaller countries like the tiny island nation of Malta, with a population the size of Edinburgh's. Yet again, Scots were told that the only way to guarantee remaining in the EU was to vote to remain in the UK. Supporters of the UK clearly lied. 10 years on from the 2014 referendum, when Scots were told that energy prices and the cost of living would go through the roof if Scotland voted to leave the UK, the reverse has happened and Keir Starmer's government has made things worse for many by cutting winter fuel payments for pensioners. 31% of Scots now live in fuel poverty, and 200,000 Scots have to rely on food banks just to survive in this energy-rich, resource-rich country. The No campaign, which portrayed Scotland as weak and dependent on England to survive, was called Better Together. But hardly anyone in Scotland feels better off, let alone better together. And whilst Unionists claim that Scotland can govern itself with its own devolved Parliament in Edinburgh, the reality is that England not only controls the Parliament as an executive branch of Westminster, but it also controls Scotland's budgets, which impacts on what Scotland is able to do to mitigate against damaging UK policies such as austerity, privatisation, the massive cost of PPI projects, and disastrous policies like Freeports, which hand over sovereignty over large swathes of Scotland to private corporations. And the government in England is shutting down Scotland's only and profitable oil refinery to make Scotland artificially dependent on getting its oil refined in England, which has 5 refineries even though it produces no oil. There is no doubt that a handful of billionaires have got massively better off, as Scotland continues to be illegally asset stripped by England masquerading as the UK, and England's direction of travel is unlikely to change anytime soon, leaving Scotland powerless to do things differently in any meaningful way. So far, the mainstream media has been able to hold the line with their narrative that Scotland is weak and dependent on England, which is one of the main reasons why Scotland has so far rejected its own independence. But as fewer people watch mainstream TV news or read newspapers anymore, and get their information from social media and channels such as this one, support for the Union will continue to be under pressure, especially among the younger age demographic, who are the future and who have the right to a better future than is being offered at the present time. The result of this shift is that the government in England is tightening its grip on Scotland, which it cannot afford to lose. Whilst they say that Scots have the right to choose their own future, the British state will never repeat the mistake they made in 2014 of giving Scots another vote. That's because they thought support for independence would remain at around 27% the first time around, and they would win comfortably. But despite giving people who had no stake in Scotland the right to vote, and despite claims of postal vote rigging, at one point support for ending the Union was sitting at over 50%. Panicked and alarmed, English politicians hurriedly broke election rules again by announcing the vow in the Daily Record just a few days before the vote, making a raft of promises few, if any of which have since been delivered. The government in England maintains Scots have the right to leave whenever they choose to, but refuses to say exactly how this can be achieved, and the goalposts keep shifting. At one time, all that was required, according to the English Parliament, was that Scotland needed to return a majority of independents supporting Scottish MPs to the Scottish benches. This was achieved by the SNP twice, yet Scotland remains shackled to England. But the con trick, which is the UK itself, is going to be challenged through the international courts at some point by groups such as Salvo, which will demonstrate that Scotland was annexed and that it is no more than a colony of England. And given that the government in England masquerading as the UK signed the United Nations Decolonisation Charter in 1961, it will have to prove Scotland is not a colony when it is challenged to let Scotland go. Salvo say that a decision in favour of Scotland's right to self-determination would still result in a democratic event in Scotland, where Scots themselves would have the final say. But such a decision would ensure that Scots would be able to exercise their right to self-determination, a right protected under international law, whenever they choose to, not when the Government of England allows them to. And whenever the people of Scotland wish to exercise their right to decide their own future, such a referendum would be run in accordance with rules set out by the UN Charter and not by the colonising state. If you have found this film informative, please like, share and subscribe to the Scotland channel. Hit the notification bell icon for details of new films from this channel. To find out how you can exercise your sovereign right as a citizen in Scotland and support the aims of Salvo, visit their website at salvo.scot. For information about the Scotland channel, including forthcoming films and details about how you can support us, go to our website thescotlandchannel.tv.
Hills, battle's over, 3-4. Hey.
Wow.